There are now enough elected votes in Congress to release the Epstein Files. And basically, when the shutdown is over, under the current newly elected membership of Congress, there should be the 218 votes to override the Republican opposition and actually release new Epstein Files. So that is a big headline. I'm going to get into that in this breakdown. I'm Ari Melber, the MSNBC anchor, chief legal correspondent. I'm also going to talk about, in this breakdown, this hat, which Steve Bannon sent me, and speaks to one of the big problems we have in America, where you have politicians openly talking about trying to end democracy as we know it. So I'm going to get to that in this breakdown. But we begin with the Epstein Files, and we actually are at a turning point which, but for the government shutdown, would mean that we have now the votes in Congress to see the rest of what DOJ under Donald Trump is hiding about Epstein. That's a major development. There are basically very few ways in Congress to get something for a floor vote without having leadership wanting it. That's just how the congressional rules have always worked in the modern era. And so the Republicans under Speaker Johnson have gone along with Donald Trump to hide any new release of Epstein Files, material from the case, material that could be meaningful and important for the public to know, or even raise questions about how he died, what other avenues and leads were not pursued. And so that's usually where these things stop, and the Republicans, backed by Johnson, have tried to stop things there. But there are now 218 elected votes to release the Epstein Files. What does that mean? It means that there's a discharge petition, there's a lot of congressional language about it, and basically because of this new special election, there has been a new member of Congress elected that's going to join and would be that last final vote that they were waiting on because they had to a 17. Mike Johnson is trying to buy time and is refusing to seat that person, Congressperson-elect Grijalva. There are now lawsuits on that. I'll say just briefly because that's a new kind of development. The precedent is not very good to get the courts to interfere and sort of fast track seating that new member of Congress. Johnson is not seating her and says that when the government reopens, he will do so. That's a lot slower than he's seated other members who were newly elected in special elections in Republican districts, basically with the Republican one. But it's not necessarily automatically unconstitutional. And the courts, I can just tell you, generally don't like to jump in and get involved. They have off-ramps to avoid it, political questions doctrine. You have to go all the way back to Adam Clayton Powell, the Harlem congressman who did win an election, and the Congress was trying not to seat him, and the Supreme Court basically intervened. But it's rare. What does that mean for the Epstein case? It means that you may not get any action on this till the government reopens. If Congress is not forced by the courts to do something, then however long the shutdown goes is how long this goes. I want to touch on what the Epstein Files could actually yield, and then turn in this breakdown to the talk of Trump 2028, which is blatantly unconstitutional, illegal, tantamount, similar to a coup, if you actually tried to get a third term for any president. But on the files themselves, all we know is that the Justice Department under Trump has backtracked completely and broken the vows of what was the claim by both Donald Trump as a candidate and the people he put in charge at DOJ and FBI that they would quickly release these Epstein Files, and they haven't. So what's actually in them is itself obviously unknown. This could be, and I want to be clear, a case where everyone's excited to get them, and if you actually got the files, there might not be anything all that substantive or interesting. But one reason that is not currently the best guess, and that's all it is really, is a guess, is that if there was some easy tranche or pile of files that didn't have anything really hot in it, and there's been this much pressure and Trump had campaigned on releasing it and Bondi had reviewed it, well, then it might be in your interest, legally, politically, and otherwise, to just release it, maybe with some redactions, and then you could say you have. So the reason, which is speculative, that many people, legal experts, people who follow this case, even putting aside politics or conspiracy theories, the reason a lot of people think there might be something in it is that A, they're acting like there's something in it because they're going so far and taking heat and risk to hide it. And B, there's been reporting in the Wall Street Journal elsewhere that there's already some things that are interesting, like Donald Trump's name recurring, which doesn't mean legally that he's accused of wrongdoing or did anything wrong pursuant to this case, but it does mean that the Journal has sources, they say, standing by their reporting, that implicates him in it in some way. We don't know whether that actually is based on his prior social history and dealings with Epstein back in the day, or more recently, the fact that he's the former president. Remember, he was the president overseeing the Justice Department when Epstein suspiciously died in prison. There's also, I'm just looking at some notes I wanted to get into in the breakdown, there's also these big questions about blackmail. Trump's own cabinet official, Lutnick, kind of got everyone all excited and outraged again when he said that Epstein was clearly blackmailing people. Well, if he is at all correct, and he knew Epstein personally and is in the Trump cabinet and has more sources than a lot of people, if he's at all correct, that raises the question of why the DOJ, under both parties, by the way, because there was time to look into this, both in the original period, in the DOJ period after Trump left office, that's the Biden era of Merrick Garland, and then again recently, why hasn't any DOJ pursued those claims in those potential cases? Blackmail is referenced in the Pam Bondi, a very controversial, very kind of thin 2-page memo that says there was nothing to see here, no cases. But these files, if they name, for example, people who paid Epstein a lot of money, sometimes in very suspicious circumstances, then did they look into a blackmail case there? Did they look into whether people were either victims of extortion or were participants, perhaps, in an alleged conspiracy? Sometimes if you're being blackmailed, you could be innocent of any crime. Other times it could be a crime, allegedly, that's being used to blackmail the person. So these files, if they even make vague or possible references to that type of activity, that action, that's something that the DOJ would be pressed on whether they should have investigated or should now. And then Epstein's death conditions. This is something that maintains a lot of interest to people because there were so many suspicious details. I've reported on some of this, as have many others. The Miami Herald has done a lot of reporting on Epstein, both in the early period and then after his suspicious death under the Barr Justice Department in the Trump first term. But among other things, that was investigated by the Inspector General, that's sort of the watchdog of the DOJ, which found that Epstein had reviewed his last will and testament and signed it in front of his lawyers right in the period before the period that he was found dead in his cell, that he made an unauthorized phone call, that people involved in the oversight of his cell specifically in the BOP, the Bureau of Prisons in that era, had lacked candor, that's sort of the legal term, but ultimately basically had lied to investigators, which raises the question of why. Were they just covering up that they let someone die in custody if it was a suicide, which in that case is bad, or were they covering up something else? So the Justice Department's Inspector General did that investigation and even found those negative things. It is an open question whether you really got access to the full files, whether there would be other details, questions, or things that are somehow suspicious about the circumstances of Epstein's death. So we just don't know. And again, I say that not as a cop-out. I say that to be very clear, because some people like to maybe lean into what you don't know or use it to stoke interest. I'm not at all interested in trying to do that, but to say that from a legal and investigative and journalistic view, those are the types of questions you have going in the files. All right, I want to turn here to the next thing in this breakdown. I'm doing these legal breakdowns. You can always subscribe to my YouTube channel, Ari Melber, like and subscribe and keep up with me. But this is a note I received from Steve Bannon, which says very simply, my name, Trump 2028, and is signed. This came with this hat. And I mentioned this now. He sent this a few weeks back, and I didn't mention it in our coverage, and I don't think we should always over-respond to these types of things or trolling. But now that the president is again discussing an illegal third term, the Speaker of the House, Republican Mike Johnson, dismissed it and said there's no path to that, which is fact-check true. Legally, there is no path. And this is all back in the news. I want to discuss that as sort of my second topic in this breakdown. Again, just looking at some notes I wanted to share with you guys. The first thing politically that we have to keep in mind is what is true and what the goals are. So if somebody is trying to trick, or the word of the year now, troll you, and you care about truth and evidence, what's really going on politically? Before we even get to the obvious constitutional fact that you can't run for a third term. And I think first is Steve Bannon, who's someone that I've interviewed and reported on and dealt with, is a political communicator. That's something he prides himself on. And he continues to bring up the idea that Trump could be something other than a lame duck. And I say it that way because even before, again, the law, Bannon, who was the leader of the homestretch victorious 2016 campaign, who's been in and out of the White House, may be doing something that is more political than practical here. Meaning, whether or not you get to an attempt to hold power past 2028, which you have to take seriously given everything going on, and I'll get to that. First, you have to look at what is often called in political science the Overton window, which a lot of people know about, but it's basically the idea that if this is the realm of what is accepted sort of traditional or conventional ideas in political debate, and boy has that changed lately, but if this is the idea that you want to go and shoot out of that, you want to be putting ideas over here to expand the window of what's acceptable. And any side could do that. I mean, as a communications tactic, it's actually neutral, that you could do that around this conservative idea that you want taxes not only low, you want taxes to go to zero. Well, no government runs on zero taxes, but just as an example, you could start pushing that idea and get that out there in people's heads so that the negotiation you do offer sounds maybe more rational to some or less extreme than the zero, right? That's just the window. You could do a liberal example, whatever. Here we're talking about something very serious. We're talking about people who were caught trying to overthrow the 2020 election, who were in some cases criminally indicted and convicted. In other cases, we didn't get to trial. Donald Trump in our legal system was never tried on those matters because he actually won re-election when he ran again, as you know, in 24. So in all fairness, some of those were adjudicated, some weren't. But we're dealing with people from Trump on down who did try to overthrow the 2020 election. So when they talk about other plots to mess with the outcome of elections or break laws, we're not starting at neutral. We're starting from the inference of they've done this before, tried it, plotted. But before we get to that, in the Overton window, Donald Trump constitutionally, legally, is a lame duck. Midterms are this year. Maybe he'll do well, and he'll be an empowered lame duck, but his time is still running out. And if you look all throughout history, lame duck, when you are headed towards the end of your power as a president, tends to be when you become less relevant. The Congress and others are serving in different terms. Senators are doing 6-year terms. A president who's approaching his last 3, 2, 1 year left is dealing with people who are very much looking past him. And so politically, there is clearly an effort to make Trump seem like he's going to last longer, expand his power. There's also efforts to do that by abusing power, and we can report on that. I cover that a lot. If you're watching, you probably know about that. But if this is a communications tactic, even introducing the very idea that something illegal that can't happen in a democracy like ours is possible, plausible, that expands it. And then you could imagine if he wants some other thing, some other role past 2028, which I'll talk about in a minute, suddenly that sounds like, according to Bannon's pitch, a middle ground from going all the way out here to the idea that we would end democracy and our constitutional rule. So that's number one. You're normalizing other options if you allow that to happen. And so while we've seen this tactic before, you say something's a joke or you let an outside person float it, then you take it back. It's very unpopular if you tell Americans that you don't respect their vote and you want to end democracy, even for those who are very loyal to Trump on other issues. And so we've seen the limits of that. Trump keeps having people basically float this, then back off it. At one point it was a joke, at another point it's an outside advisor, but it keeps coming up. And so I think that's one part of it. And I mention this because Mr. Bannon sent this to me, and I presume, I don't know who else he sent it to, but he's talking to reporters. He most recently talked to The Economist about it. He's using different methods to put this out there, to normalize and launder these ideas. Trump obviously likes doing that. He puts the hats out when he's meeting with Democrats and other things in the Oval Office. And so that's a bit of the strategy part. The fact that they were caught trying to hold on to power and overthrow the 2020 election is the context for all of this. And I got to tell you, just being clear here in the breakdowns I share, I find it really extraordinary sometimes how the country lived through this insurrection. It became the biggest federal probe in our history. And all these people went to jail for crimes against the United States, sedition, violence against police. And Trump, of course, let them all free on the first day in office, something that J.D. Vance and others said he should not do even after the election, because that's how extreme it was. And I'm just sometimes noticing that maybe because it's negative, traumatic, or there's so many other things going on, people really seem to try to put that aside. People either because they want to sort of normalize the world we're in, or they don't want to think about it, or they want to focus on other things. But that's the baseline for all of this, whether you're talking about the rule of law, or this hat and where it fits in, or political violence. There was political violence on January 6th, famously. I actually wrote an essay about this. This is, of course, before the 24 election, that it was called The Coup Conspiracy. And it was one of the versions of the January 6th report. And I always mention, you don't have to buy this. You can go download the January 6th report and read that part for free online. But I did chart in there something that has sadly remained relevant, which is how many people around Trump did try to overthrow the results of the election. And some of the plots they pursued that failed are more important now, perhaps, than they were then, because he did lose, and we did transfer power on the 20th, and it seemed like a different moment. So you have to remember, he tried to get Sidney Powell to use the military to go after ballots. They just failed. Giuliani warned they would end up in prison if they actually did try a kind of military-style coup, and that was abandoned. They tried to do fraudulent electors, which was seen as very far-fetched. The idea that you would go into Congress the day of the January 6th certification and just, wave around some paper and say, no, actually the state we lost, we won, and that would somehow help members of Congress overthrow the election. Now that failed. They even tried to give some of those papers to Mike Pence, who was not going to join that kind of coup. But I mention that all now, not just as history, but to say that when they're now talking about a third term, that might not be the way he holds on to power, but it could be one of several ideas or plots that is being tested and pursued. And by the time you get to an election, if they do hold on to Republican power, maybe that's good enough, quote unquote, for Trump. But if you imagine a scenario in 28 that looks more like 20, where the party has lost power and they are looking for a way to hold on, either directly through Trump staying in office as the outgoing president, or by claiming that the losing Republican nominee won, you can imagine several of these different plots. Now, in this report, I actually went through several of them, and several were public, and so they've been documented. Looking towards 24, there are already these sort of seemingly, I want to say, unlawful ideas to circumvent what is obviously the limit on the president serving 2 terms. Doesn't mean much if you say he can't serve 2 terms and then you call him, Mr. Extra President, and he's still in office, but you have some different titling. Obviously, if he's holding on to power and breaking the Constitution, he or any politician, then that's that. But one of these sort of out-of-the-box, probably unlawful ideas was, what if he ran as vice president and then assumed the presidency? Or you could imagine in the same scenario, because Trump addressed it this week, so I'm just responding to the discourse that's out there. You can imagine a scenario where the president has a different name, and the vice president is the former president, but starts trying to basically carry out the duties of president. So it's just a little switcheroo. There are a lot of reasons why the military shouldn't take orders from someone other than the commander-in-chief, and the Supreme Court should back that up. But you can imagine those things. Now, Trump ruled that out. He said that was, quote, too cute. But again, when you're dealing with people who were caught trying to do this once, and they're now both publicly laundering these ideas and perhaps, and there's a group, Third Term Project and others that are looking at this, trying to figure out these ways, then yeah, I think you have to take that seriously. Now, I mentioned all the plots that were discarded. When you look across world history and other semi-constitutional, semi-democratic systems, there are other ways that you could try to circumvent a constitutional limit, a term limit or a limit on one ruler's power, without simply running them for a third term out in the open or running them for more positions. I'm a lawyer, and there are quite specific examples that would potentially be more enticing for the Supreme Court to approve than just saying you want a third term and you're blatantly breaking the law. Now, I'm not going to brainstorm or list those for some would-be autocrat right here. There may be examples that people around law and constitutional history could think of. There may be some they can't. But in the same way that in reporting, we don't disseminate step-by-step instructions to make an illegal bomb. I'm not, as a lawyer who's again written about this and wrote the coup conspiracy essay and has interviewed a lot of these players, but on both sides, I'm not going to actually give you all those steps or release them in public. But I don't think it's a spoiler or secret that there are other steps. And so we should all be quite vigilant, those of us who still care about the rule of law and democracy in a nonpartisan way, as this is all being brainstormed. The last point I want to walk through, again, this is in my report for you. If you're watching, maybe you're still interested, but here's the last point. How would this actually work if we get closer to them really pursuing 28? Well, the first thing that would happen is you would actually see a candidate like Trump, if they're really going to test whether they can do it, try to declare that he's running for office. We still have laws in this country about how the money is organized and how you get on the ballot. We have states, some run by Republicans, some run by Democrats. And so the first test point in the courts, if Trump literally pursued a third term, would be to declare he's running for one and try to get on the ballot. Legally, under the law, constitutionally, he'd be ineligible. That's what Speaker Johnson said, no path. That's what members of the Supreme Court have referred to in past cases, because there have been many cases on term limits where they're enforced, although no one has been as brazen as to try to just run for a third term since the Constitution got the 22nd Amendment limiting it. And so if he tried, you would quickly have a case on that, and the lower courts would rule against it, because there's clear precedent. The Constitution bars you from any third term as president. The Supreme Court could just leave that stand, and then he literally wouldn't be on the ballot. So it would be a big public loss and kind of humiliating for trying to become a dictator and losing that way. Or the Supreme Court could take the case and affirm it. Or you can imagine, is there a world where this Supreme Court changes it? It's really a matter you can't predict. You can show that Justice Barrett, who was even appointed by Trump, recently said, well, the 22nd Amendment is the answer on that, which is bad news for him. That's a no. Justice John Roberts doesn't show any interest in breaking the Constitution like that we've seen. So if you're counting votes just based on that, it doesn't seem they would do that. And that's how this would be tested if Steve Bannon is being serious and not just trying to broaden the window, and if Donald Trump thinks that this is something he should actually pursue. So the first test of this would come then, and all evidence suggests that wouldn't get very far in the courts. The backup alternate, which Bannon and others are alluding to, is maybe there's some other way, whether Trump calls it cute or not, to try to see whether you can hold on to power, stay in office, somehow share power, etc. So I don't see it as our role as lawyers and journalists to publicly outline all of those steps. But I do think when you look at the 2020 plots, which ranged from valid lawsuits, which they have every right to file, and they lost, and the Supreme Court didn't see any case that challenged Trump's loss, so they never took a Trump-Biden case in 20, to things they did that were questionable, like the alternate electors. In the beginning, you're allowed to line them up, but by Jan 6th, after you've gone through the process, you can't just commit elector fraud. That's why some of the lawyers got in trouble. To the military plot I mentioned, which failed, to having states meet to override the voters in their own state. That's something they tried and failed to do. You might remember Giuliani giving presentations, to what ultimately happened, which was the hijacking of the certification process. They actually delayed it. They actually committed crimes, you remember? They actually, according to the juries of the United States, committed sedition. If all of that went that far, again, not talking about only Trump, who was not convicted of those things in fairness, but others around him were in service of trying to overthrow his loss. If all that already happened, then yes, we should take very seriously ongoing public or semi-public discussions about how to keep Trump in power in 28, even if the president currently says he doesn't want to do it by running for a third term. So be vigilant about what we know about the past to protect the democracy in the future. Thanks for watching. You can always subscribe to my Ari Melber YouTube